So today's notes are going to be about the theory of island biogeography. And I think it's important to note before we get started here that islands don't necessarily need to mean the islands that we typically think about, like an island in the middle of the ocean or off the coast of a continent. Islands can also be areas where the habitat was fragmented because of development. So if we're building, you can see this a lot when we drive out, like if you drive out in the country, like towards Fort Wayne, um, you'll see where there's areas where there's forest and then farmland, and then forest and then farmland. So that area of forest can actually be considered an island amongst the farmland. Same thing with neighborhoods. We have a lot of neighborhoods in the area where there's a neighborhood and then a forest area, neighborhood forest area. And so again, that forested area would be considered an island amongst the neighborhoods. Okay, so island biogeography. Let me go ahead and start the slideshow. All right, so island biogeography is the study of ecological relationships and community structure on islands. And this just kind of mentions again how these islands don't necessarily need to be bodies of water. But when an island forms, whether it be in the ocean, like the Hawaiian Islands, or on land, immigration or the arrival of new species and extinction, the death of current species occurs. As this extinction increases, immigration increases because new areas that were once occupied by former species are now open. And so new organisms will move into that area. And then as more and more, of those immigrant species arrive, the room actually runs out. We're finding there'll be less and less habitat or less and less resources. And then that extinction rate begins to increase slightly. And eventually it'll kind of reach a balancing point where the it'll be at more of a sustainable level. So the immigration will eventually kind of level off, and so will the extinction kind of level off to a sustainable point. Okay, so there's two basic rules. I forgot to remove this from this slide. Sorry about that. But there's two basic rules or observations of island biogeography. The first is that larger islands support more total species. So the bigger that an island is, the more habitats that are available and the more species that can live there. This also means that we have greater ecosystem diversity on larger islands, just because of that increase in food and habitat as compared to a smaller island. There's more niches or roles or habitable areas that an organism can play in the ecosystem. The second rule that you need to know for island biogeography is that the island closer to the mainland can actually support more species. So it's easier for colonizing organisms to reach the island from the mainland, and more colonizing organisms means more genetic diversity in the new population. So here's an image that kind of shows this. The larger the island, more increased, higher numbers of species. So as the island area increases, the number of species increases as well. Distance from mainland, the closer that you are, this is an inverse relationship. The closer that you are to the mainland, the more species that can be supported, and the further that you move away from a mainland, the amount of species that are supported there decreases. So you can see this in this picture. These two little islands are fairly similar in size. This island has more species. This has less. And this is a larger island than this island. So again, more species supported here than supported here. That just kind of that's kind of common sense for this. This is because fewer and fewer, the distance, because it's further to travel, fewer species actually make it to this island. And so there's going to be less genetic diversity there. Okay, so larger islands support more species, like we say. They have more available niches or roles. And you can think of all the different, I tend to think of the really famous example of the birds on the Galapagos Islands. There's a lot of different sources of food. And so because all those different food sources are available to the birds on the Galapagos Island, They are able to move into different areas on the islands themselves. There's also on larger islands larger population sizes, more genetically diverse, and they're more that just means that they're more genetically diverse and more resistant to disturbance. They're resilient. They're able to survive disturbance more effectively. And then there's also a lower extinction rate. Um, so the species are just less likely to die off because of all of these things that we've mentioned previously. So again, there's a positive correlation or a direct relationship between island size and island and species richness. As island size increases, the number of species increases as well. All right, and then distance to mainland. Again, we'll look a little more closely here at that second rule that you need to know for island geography. Again, the closer to the mainland equals higher species richness. So as I said before, it's easier for more species to migrate from the mainland to the island if it's closer to the mainland. Okay, so just that proximity or the closeness makes a big difference. There's also more continual migration of individuals to the island habitat, so it's happening frequently. If there's habitat that can be that becomes open, or a niche that becomes open, an immigrant can actually move in and occupy that area. Frequent by migration, because things are frequently coming in and out of a population or of an area of an ecosystem. We end up with more genetic diversity. And again, more genetic diversity just means a larger population size. So this sort of shows you the frequent migration that can happen between here and here, and here and here, and between here and here. It doesn't really happen as much here. Um, but you can see this island A is going to be a lot more biodiverse than island C. It's closer to the mainland. And so since it's closer, that's what we end up with. So um, island size is a direct relationship to biodiversity, but distance to mainland is actually a indirect or inverse relationship. So what that means is the further away from the mainland, the fewer species. So as distance increases, the number of species, no, I said that wrong. As distance increases, the number of species decreases. Okay, something else that you should know about island biogeography is that islands are home to many endemic species. Endemic species are organisms that are naturally found on that island. So I think of many of the bird species that live on the Hawaiian Islands and many of the plant species that live there as well. They're endemic, they're native plants to those islands. They are highly adapted to their specific ecosystem. So if you were to take them out of their ecosystem and put them in a new ecosystem, they wouldn't be able to survive. Invasive species will actually immigrate to these island habitats because they're brought in many times by like storms that blow birds, for instance, further or off their normal route. And so they end up on these islands. Or we travel in boats, and then the organisms kind of stow away as on the boat from the mainland, and then they arrive on the island, and now they are freed and they are able to populate the island. So, endemic species that are native to an area tend to be highly specialized, like I mentioned before. We consider organisms that are highly specialized, which means that they need that ecosystem to survive. We say that they are specialist species. This means that their ecological niche, or the areas and the role that they play in that area, is very narrow. All right. These specialists are sensitive to environmental changes, and they are also, because they're sensitive to these changes, they can be outcompeted for resources by non native or invader species. Invader species are highly adaptable. And they are considered to be a generalist species. The reason that they were able to move from one area to another and then thrive in that new area is because they have a very broad niche, which means that they're able to um, survive on in a lot of different habitats. They also have no natural predators in an area, So this also allows them to populate an area quite easily. So examples of both specialist and generalist species. A generalist species would be something like a raccoon, um, a, a sparrow, types of sparrows, basic birds that we would have normally here that can live throughout the United States. That would be a generalist species. Rats, deer, things that can live in a variety of areas. A specialist species would be something like a kiwi bird um, in New Zealand. It's highly adapted to that area. It wouldn't be able to live any place new. Or a koala, a panda bear, organisms that feed on specific things and live in specific areas, then they wouldn't be able to live in basically any habitat. So that's the difference between endemic and invasive species and generalist and specialist species. Those are all four terms that you should know. All right, generalists, let me hide my picture because it's kind of blocking things here. Generalists are more resilient, like we said before, and they can outcompete other organisms for resources. So that's the only thing that I sort of missed on that slide. Okay, evolution on islands. So natural selection occurs, um, and the reason that that happens is because islands have very limited space and resources. And so it really creates unique conditions for evolution to occur through natural selection. There's more pressure for species on these islands with specific habitats to adapt to more narrow niches. So, in other words, they adapt to more specific food and specific habitat. So, if I'm looking at one of the Galapagos Islands, you can see that there's four different areas or zones on one island. And so the habitat and the plants and the other resources that are found in these different zones are very different from one another. And so we end up having something like finches. Finches are immigrants. They would move into these different areas. And then over many generations, they would develop specific characteristics that allowed them to thrive in each of these different situations. We call this adaptive radiation. When a single species, the original population of finches, for example, move into a new area, they use different resources and they actually do better if they spread out into these different areas so that they're not competing, they're reducing the competition for resources. And the Galapagos finches are so famous because these were actually discovered by Darwin. The birds had very similar body shapes and body plans, but they had very specific beaks that were developed to eat the different types of seeds or trees or insects or whatever was in that were in these different zones on the Galapagos Islands. So the different beaks quickly evolved to fit the variety of different food sources. And so here's what you can see, all of the different finches that would have come from this original ancestor that came from the South American mainland. And now we have all of these different finches that have developed on the island to be able to survive in these different niches. So an example of something else that happens on due to island biogeography. All right, so that's it for the notes today. For the practice FRQ for 2.3, you're going to describe the processes of colonizing an island habitat. Describe how the island's distance from the mainland influences the number of species that will colonize the island habitat. Don't forget to include your vocabulary when you're writing, um, answering questions. AP wants you to be able to use vocabulary appropriately, so make sure that you do that. And again, don't forget to check your answers for this on OneNote. Thanks. If you have any questions, make sure you're talking to me in class.